Good morning, afternoon, good day. I am been getting information and digging into some stuff. So I have been compiling some of the stuff, and I wanted to go ahead and bring in the information that I have been compiling and that I have gotten. And I've put them on my website. So if you go to the inwitteord.com website, I actually changed up the name of the page and a little bit of the function on the page this stuff is on. But if you go and go to that site and you go underneath the rewriting the Western Hemisphere part of that site, it will give you access to articles on these sites that we're talking about today so that you can find more information yourself. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about the Heatlauco site, and I was talking to somebody else about it, and they pointed out to me the Calico site, which I had not heard about. And Leaky actually worked on the Calico site. Hello, hello, hello. And so, with that, I wanted to come in and talk about it because to me that's pretty huge. Um, so I wanted to talk about that. We'll talk a bit about the Sruti Macedon side as well. We haven't really discussed that in our lives yet a whole lot. Like we've talked about it a little bit, but not like in depth. So let's go ahead and talk about those as well. Right on. And I would like, as you guys, hi YouTube. I would like, as you guys are finding things, if you can tell me of anything that you're finding that predates the Western academic accepted timeline of us here, that's amazing for me. And I can go ahead and compile more of it, put more of it together, and I can go ahead and dig in and find out, what the disputes are and what the evidence is so that we can get that information out there a little bit more to other people. And so I want to make sure that we're getting more information out, that we're seeing, all of these things that we're having going on here, right? So if you know of any sites that I have not mentioned, or know of anything that kind of rewrites the history of the Western Hemisphere from the white academic standpoint, or predates the accepted timeline for the islands of the South Pacific or Australia as well. I know that the accepted timelines for many of the islands of the South Pacific are within the last 10,000 years, right? And so I know that there's a lot more information out there, and I'd like to get that out for them as well. So if you have any information that you're seeing as you're coming across this stuff and it goes, oh, wow, that's prior to 40,000 years ago here, or that's prior to 15,000 years ago there, or prior to 70,000 years ago in Australia, let me know, because we can use that and dig in. And we do need to dig more, kind of. Like I'm a little bit back and forth, right? Because we know that there are many different nations, and the respect for their sovereignty is important, and many different nations who do not want us digging, right? That digging up bones, digging up belongings, it really is disrespectful to many people's ancestors. And so I believe that we need to have more information, absolutely, right? And yet, I also believe that my need for more information or anybody else's need for more information should not supersede autonomy and sovereignty and the right of people to speak for their grandparents, right? Their ancestors, to not have somebody else be speaking for their ancestors, right? Just because I want more information doesn't need, right? Um, And exact locations do help. We have a lot of new stuff that we're doing these days that kind of helps with some of this stuff that we can do it in a more holistic manner, I guess would be a good term for it, but a more healthy manner that's not actually, um, digging too or not digging too deep, but not getting into harming, right? Not causing harm. And so, like we have topographic lidar kind of scale things that we can do these days, and we have a few different methods. Like you can core sample to get samples without having to like dig up an entire thing. So you can get dating by that, and then use lidar to penetrate the ground to see what's it what layers. So maybe if we're seeing something 5 or 6 layers down and we core sample it, we see the line on it. We can get DNA from core samples these days. We don't know. It's that the ghost species within us. It's the one that it's whoever speciated from Homo erectus here. We haven't named them, right? We haven't given them a name yet. So they would be, I mean, personally, I think we're looking at Homo giganticus, but that's just my little geek out, right? It's going to be that species that speciates from Homo erectus here that we envelop within Avialians and Turtle Islanders when we arrive as sapiens. So we don't have a name on who they are. Hi, Canary. They just predate us. Um, Polly, if you have more, I'm taking names. I has a paper and a pad. I has a pen. I am taking names. If you have more sites, I'm not going to look them up as we're talking, most likely. I'll probably go and look them up later. But if you have more sites than the ones that I have behind me that predate 40,000 years ago, I do have a couple other sites that predate 40,000 years ago on my website that I've put in there that I've found information on. The Topper site in or in South Carolina, and then there's another one in Mexico that are both 50,000 years old, right? So um, I don't think the arbitrary line of sapien is really there when we get to the peopling of the globe, because by the time we move out to people the globe, we've really become sapien. You can ask any question you want. And thank you so much, Star. I appreciate that. I'm having fun with it. It's got multiple colors in it. I've got to update it because I did it a couple weeks ago and it's starting to grow out a little bit. So I got to add some more color up closer. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, ooh, hey, be careful with that shit. Drink plenty of water. I know that you're not supposed to right away, but make sure that you do because it's spicy things can kill you. That's awesome, though. That's a great way to do that, is to do challenges and stuff like that for mutual aid. That's really cool. But be careful because I love you and I need to make sure. Okay, okay. I love you. So you're my zip. I need to make sure you're okay. So uh awesome. And I'll see if I can find the video. We're still evolving. Evolution doesn't stop and it's not linear. Evolution can go backwards. Mutations can take evolution backwards, right? And evolution kind of moves all over the place, right? So there's definitely different ways. UK Tico, is it up Yucateco for the whole site? I'm not sure if that's a site or if it's a people. Um, I don't think ethnicity is necessarily about traits. It's about genetic heritage, and genetic heritage doesn't always just. Oh, okay, okay. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Genetic heritage doesn't always display physical traits that we would see. If we are descendants of the OG sapien, but all mixed with other hominins, can we really say any point of origin? Um, So we can say a point of origin for sapien, right? And we can say a point of origin for Neanderthal, and we can say a point of origin for Denisovan, and we can say a point of origin for the species that speciates here, and a point of origin for the species that speciates in Australia. We can say a point of origin for Naledi in Africa. If we're talking about point of origin being within a specific, it's a space instead of a time. If we're talking point of origin as a space instead of a time. Um, and for me, I find that I feel that those things are important, especially when we're talking about erasure. Yes, so that would support multi-regional theory, yet it also supports Africa as the point of origin for sapiens, so our point of origin, right? Yet the multi-regional theory and the fact that other species are speciating elsewhere and then we're enveloping them also supports us speciating here, or us people speciating in Australia, the indigenous Australias having speciated in Australia, right? Or the Tibetans having speciated in Tibet because they come from Denisovan heritage, and it is the Denisovan genetics that give them adaptations for that specific area, right? So I believe that where we're at, we have very much both multi-regional support of origin, point of origin, and African support of origin for sapien. And so for me, it's important to acknowledge that like a species speciates here in Turtle Island from erectus, and then we envelop them within us, because to me, that acknowledges the indigenous histories and oral traditions that talk about having been created here, because that's how Turtle Island indigenous people and Avialan indigenous people are in part created here, because one of the species within them is created here, right? Yet for me, it's also important to make sure that we understand and specify that we are all one species. Even with admixture, we're all one species as Homo sapiens, because for me, if we don't support that, that's just more division. It's just more ways to other us, right? So I believe that, Kai, that's not what that states in any way, shape, or form. I believe that we have to understand that there is more to the story, right? And we also have to understand how these things both support traditions of what was the traditions that are there, as well as support. Um, as well as support the fact that we're all together, like we're just all one species, right? So for me, it kind of goes to both, right? um, and for me, it is important to make the distinctions and also make a distinction of what the distinctions mean, if that makes sense, right? So first, you're not indigenous, please don't use the word Indian, it's rude. um, BLM as in Bureau of Land Management. And the Bureau of Land Management is really, really big on erasure. Uh, so, and you're fine, Letty. Nothing sorry on it. Um, Ethnicity to me is more about genetic heritage, your mother's mother's mother, and about lived experience. We know that phenotype doesn't indicate genotype, and we know that uh, phenotype doesn't indicate what your abilities are either, right? So, Kai, that's not what's being said. So I want to make sure that you understand what's being said, right? Nope, I want you to hear me. Can you hear me? Close your mouth and learn to listen. Okay. So, just like when Homo sapien, which you are, leaves the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula at 50,000 years ago, and they've already met with Neanderthals in the Levant area. They've gotten the genetics from the Levant area, and as they go, or from the Neanderthals who speciate in Europe, and when they go up into Europe, they don't replace the Neanderthals, they envelop the Neanderthals within them. This is not colonization. This is immigration and migration. These words have different meanings. Migration is moving through a space that is uninhabited. Immigration is moving into a space that is inhabited and becoming a part of the culture that is already there. Colonization is moving into a space that is inhabited and replacing the government with your own government. Okay. Okay. So I want you to understand that those are three different words, and they mean three different ways of moving as humans. okay, or as anything, right? So when we're looking at colonization, it is somebody moving in and replacing a current governmental structure or current societal structure with their own societal structure. That's not what happens when Homo sapiens first come to any space. Now, every space outside of Africa, and including within Africa, had other humans when Homo sapiens arrive on the scene. When Homo sapiens arrive on the scene in Africa, we arrive as a convergence of several different species of Homo, subspecies of Homo erectus, children and grandchildren of Homo erectus. And so when we arrive on the scene in Africa, we arrive from current thought process is a combination of Heidelbergensis and antecessor and erectus and maybe a couple others. And then in that, your first Homo sapien ends up being in a community of many other human species. So you don't look and see other people that look like you. So as Homo sapien is coming onto the scene, they are coming onto a scene that has people there. They are born into that scene, so they're natural to that scene. They aren't immigrating, they aren't migrating, and they certainly aren't colonizing. That's not what I'm saying. You're going to want to close your mouth and listen. If you distract me with questions, you'll never get to what you want to know. A. B. You can listen and you'll get the answers to what I'm saying. Okay. So if you'd like to, you're welcome to, right? If not, you can scroll on. That's perfectly fine too. Okay. So when Homo sapien comes into being in Africa, not only are there these other species there that we come out of, but there's other species that we don't, like Naledi. Now, we don't replace Naledi. Naledi dies out on its own. Okay. There's no evidence of violence from us to Naledi. And by the time Naledi is gone, we're not even really a species totally yet. Like we haven't solidified as a singular species yet. Now, we start around 300,000 years ago. We solidify as a species between 125,000 years ago and 135,000 years ago. Now, by this time, some of us have already moved into the northwestern part of the continent at that time of Africa, which we currently know of as the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula. At the time, because of sea levels, it's still a part of the mainland continent of Africa. When we moved into that, because of the glacial maximums, we see that the Neanderthal has moved down from Europe into this space, right? I'm trying to answer the first question you asked. And if you'll stop and listen, you'll get to what you're asking now, because it takes more than a single word to answer the question. Okay? So, when we look at Homo neanderthal, we see Homo neanderthal speciates in Europe. When we see that Homo sapien is moving out of the Levant area up into Europe and moving into the area that Neanderthal is already a part of, we see that Neanderthal is a very small species by this point. There's roughly 10,000 of them left by this point. They don't have a lot of genetics and they're getting very inbred. So they take the genetics through intimate relationships from Homo sapiens. And by taking those genetics from Homo sapiens, they continue their species. That's how you have 2% Neanderthal. And there's more Neanderthal DNA on the planet today than there was during the entirety of their species as a whole genome. So we don't see that as Homo sapien is moving into Europe, where Neanderthal has speciated, and they are the original people of that continent. We don't see them replacing them. We don't see them colonizing them. We see them immigrating into an area and becoming a part of a community and enveloping a community within their own when those communities are really small. But we see that they carry on the traits and the understandings, and we see that they use the tools. They become a part. They take the knowledge from Neanderthals, and because they're half of Neanderthal at this point, right? Half sapien and half Neanderthal at this point, right? So they're a part of. This is not colonization. It is not conquering. It is immigration and migration. Now, when we see that Homo sapien starts moving east, we see that Homo sapien comes in contact with Denisovan, and the same thing happens. You don't see them you don't see that as they're moving across towards the east that they are conquering. You don't see that they are colonizing. They're enveloping a group that's already pretty small within them, and then they're taking the adaptations from that group and carrying them on. They're taking the knowledge from that group and they're carrying it on. They're not replacing it with theirs, which is colonization. When we get to Turtle Island and Abiyala, Turtle Island is North America and Abiyala is South America. These are indigenous terms. When we get to this space as Homo sapien, we find that, like Homo erectus had already speciated in Europe, and Homo erectus had already speciated in East Asia, and in the islands of the South Pacific as Homo florensis and Homo luzonensis, we see that there is Homo erectus who has made it to Turtle Island and Abiyala, and they have speciated here in Turtle Island and Abiyala like they had everywhere else across the globe, and that the species that they speciate here becomes the calico site, becomes the Cerruti mastodon site, becomes the Heotloca site. Now, these are fully human because Homo erectus is fully human. Homo neanderthal is fully human. Homo denisovan is fully human. Human is Homo. Anything that has the genus Homo is a human species. These are fully human species. They are, at this point, our cousins pretty much. So they're as human as you are and your cousin is, right? So when we're looking at that species and Homo sapien comes in contact with that species as they move into this area, because of the fact that they had speciated in isolation, everywhere that Homo erectus speciates in isolation, Homo erectus speciates as a smaller, not in size of people, but in amount of people species. And so because the species that is here when Homo sapien gets here, the species of human that is here, our cousins that are here when we get here, is a smaller group genetically. When we get here, they get our DNA and we get their DNA. We see that there is what we call a ghost species in Turtle Island indigenous DNA and in Abayalan indigenous DNA. And this ghost species DNA is DNA that comes from a species that we see within our DNA, but we haven't found the species themselves or their genome in the fossil record. And so we call this a ghost species. This is the humans that occupy the calico site, the Cerruti mastodon site, and the Heotloca site. Okay, again, fully human, and again, not colonized. We immigrated and migrated here, and we became a part of those communities. We're a small group, they're a small group at the time. We're both small. We need each other to survive. We integrate. This is not colonization. This is not replacement. This is not conquering. There's no evidence of violence in our species prior to 10,000 years ago. We weren't violent prior to 10,000 years ago. There's no evidence in our contact with any of these other species of violence. There's never been evidence. So, the ice-free corridor is the latest route of migration to Turtle Island in North America from Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens actually start their migration through a southern boat route in the islands of the South Pacific over 50,000 years ago. Homo sapiens have been in Turtle Island for at least 50,000 years. That's the archaeological evidence of Homo sapiens in Turtle Island. So at 50,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens start moving into Turtle Island, they come in contact with the species, their cousin that is already here, and they integrate with their cousins that are already here and create a new people. Now, that new people is still very genetically Homo sapien. This is not a Turtle Island indigenous people are a different species. We're not even a different race. Race doesn't exist. Race is made up. It's a colonial construct. It is the fact that we all, every single person on this planet, has admixture from other species. Either you have admixture from Neanderthal, 2-3%, or you have admixture from, if you don't have admixture from Neanderthal, there's only two communities that don't have Neanderthal in them, and there are two communities within Africa, and those two communities have ghost species in them. So they have admixture from those ghost species, right? All migrations were peaceful at first. Violence doesn't start until 10,000 years ago. Violence doesn't start until 10,000 years ago. Before that, it is peaceful. I have the evidence that backs up what I'm saying. Archaeology states exactly what I'm saying. We have 2,000 skeletal remains prior to 10,000 years ago, and none of them have definitive violence, not a single one. There are 2% that could possibly be violence, but it's not definitive violence. Like if a head's been hit by a rock, do you know it was hit by a rock welded by another person, or do you know that it was a cave that collapsed on that head? There's no definitive violence in anybody prior to 10,000 years ago. And of the 2,000 skeletons, the things that could possibly maybe be attributed to violence, though are not definitive, is under 2%. At 10,000 years ago, definitive violence starts in the archaeological record, as in somebody tied up pregnant that's executed in the archaeological record at 10,000 years ago. And the rise of or the amount of definitive violence that we see in the archaeological record rises to 18 to 20%. And this is all stuff that has been proven by studies. This is all stuff that is archaeologically proven. So when I say violence is 10,000 years old, that's what I mean. And I am not incorrect. I am correct. I have the evidence that backs it. Okay. So, yes, the migration and immigration across the planet was peaceful because all we had ever known was people that looked different from us. Our start comes among people that look different from us. The idea that you should be othering everybody and see people as being different from you instead of seeing everybody as being the same starts as well 10,000 years ago. And it starts along with that violence, and it is being used by the government to control you. It's being used by the government for roughly 10,000 years when we see the rise of narcissistic god kings and stratification within humanity. And when we see that, we see that this is a method of controlling you. So you can buy into the method of control all you want. But remember, your government's not helping you. Your government's trying to kill you. It's trying to exploit you. And as long as you buy in to the method of control that they're using, the propaganda that they're using to control you, then you're being controlled by a government that's only out to exploit you until you become a husk and they can get rid of you. So cannibalism doesn't indicate violence. Eating our dead does not indicate that we were violent towards our dead. Some people eat their dead as a spiritual process to imbue the spirit of the dead and carry it on with them. Some people eat their dead because they're starving and they died. The Donner Party never killed anybody. Some people eat their dead because somebody else has died of starvation and they need to live. The Donner Party never killed anybody. They ate their dead, but they didn't kill their dead. Their dead died for other reasons, and they utilized the meat because they had nothing else to utilize. Cannibalism isn't evidence of violence. It can be evidence of spirituality, and it can be evidence of survival, but it is not evidence of violence. So when we look at the migration pattern of Homo sapiens across the globe, we see that every time they encounter other people, they envelop those other people within them. They become a part of those other people. You're so welcome. They become a part of those other people. They don't kill those other people. They don't harm those other people. They become a part of those other people. And we see that from the very beginning of our speciation. Within the last year, we have proven that a theoretical method of speciation that everybody had thought was pretty fantastical and probably not likely, it's pretty theoretical, is how we speciate and how Homo erectus speciates. And it is through convergence, speciation through convergence, which was again thought to be a theoretical method of speciation until this last year, that we see that both Homo erectus, convergence from Australopithecine, Paranthropus boisei, and Homo habilis, and Homo sapien, convergence from Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, or heidelbergensis, and Homo ancestor. This convergence means that when we start, when you speciate, when you come into being in your very first instant, everybody around you doesn't look like you. There's nobody else that looks like you. Your grandmother looks like an entirely different species. Find one that shows signs of violence prior to 10,000 years ago and tell me what the site is. I, on this website, have compiled sources, journal articles by accredited archaeologists that state what I'm stating. My evidence comes from accredited archaeologists. Where does your evidence come from? This website has bibliographies that show everything I'm stating is accepted fact. You need to provide the same if you're going to tell me that I and all of those scientists are wrong based on the world's smartest idiot. Like, even your username tells me that buying what you're saying is an idiotic thing to do. So when we see that we come through speciation, through convergence, we see that when we come into being among so many other people that we don't look at other people and go, oh, you look different. Really? Where did you go to school and what's your degree? And is that site prior to 10,000 years ago in Kentucky? Which would give weight to Clovis first not being true, A, and B, would give weight to people being here longer, but does not give weight to violence at all. At all. So where did you get your degree and what is your degree in? And what dig did you work on that you unearthed this? And what is the evidence of cannibalism that you unearthed? We're talking about sites here in. No, but you have to have a degree to be working on a dig and being the person that unearthed something. You have to have a degree to be the person that headed up a dig and unearthed something. And if you had a degree, you'd know that. So you unearthed nothing. The Raider site in central Kentucky. And if I go to this, I'm going to see your name associated with this site, correct? There is no Raider site in Kentucky. Yeah, there's no Raider site in Kentucky. Nice try. Yes, the audacity of mediocre white men, right? So when we come to speciation through convergence, we see that we don't come to speciation looking at others and thinking that there's something different about them. We see them as human. And because we see everything else as human until everything else is gone and we're the only ones that remain, we're not harming people that we think are human. Compassion, nurturing, and empathy is innate it is the most innate thing biologically to Homo sapiens. We are innately nurturing and we are innately communal, which means we're not innately violent. To be innately violent would be toxic to our species development, and no species develops toxic traits. Sometimes you can mutate toxic traits like narcissism or lack of empathy, yet no species develops with toxic traits. It's antithetical to the development of a species. A trait that is toxic to a species is a trait that stops the development of a species, and therefore no species can actually develop with toxic traits, or they wouldn't develop as a species, right? You're done. You haven't proven anything, and the one thing that you have said has nothing. Yeah, that site doesn't exist. The site that you're talking about doesn't exist. So you're done. Thank you for your play. You're done. Um, we're not doomed as a society. Well, maybe this type of society is doomed, but this type of society has been doomed since its inception. Stratified societies are not healthy. Stratified societies are actually really harmful to us. And stratified societies center around um, psychopathies like narcissism and megalomania, Machiavellianism, psychopathy itself, like sociopathy. So this type of society has been doomed since its inception. So it is doomed to fail. Humanity isn't doomed to fail. We just have to actually do something about it and make some effective changes. And it's more a reversion. Like we need to go back to who we were. Good for you. You haven't given any proof, and I'm done listening to you. You haven't given anything except for running your mouth. Like most mediocre fucking white men, take it elsewhere. You're no longer speaking in my life. Goodbye. So, when we're looking at sites here in the Americas that predate 70,000 years or predate 40,000 years ago, right? Predate 50,000 years ago. There's a few that are out there. There's also a few that are 40, 50,000 years old that are sapien sites, right? We are supposed to live communally, Letty. And actually, biologically, I can prove this. So, biologically, sapien is the only animal on the planet that has what we call mandatory midwifed childbirth. And this is because of the shape of the head and the shape of the shoulders and the shape of the pelvic outlet of the mother and the way that a neonate, a newborn, is delivered. So, because of these things, we have to have assistance during our childbirth. That's mandatory midwifery. Neanderthal had this as well. They're gone though, so we're the only ones still around that has mandatory midwifery. Now, what this is that the shape of the pelvic outlet, it's not a circle; it's kind of like an oval, right? And it's a little bit tilted. And when you look at the head of a neonate, you can see, or a newborn, or even me today, you can see that it's an oval going back to front. And then when you look at my shoulders, you can see that they're oval going side to side, right? So when you're looking at this, when you see a child being born, we start out with our nose facing backwards. Now, when you look at things like the great apes, the neonates are extremely small compared to a very round pelvic outlet, and the neonate is born with the nose facing forward so that the mother can reach down and just pull it up to her chest, right? Pull that baby up to her chest. With us, we start with that very narrow, very oval pelvic outlet that is tilted, and our neonates start out facing with their nose backwards. So if we were just to reach and grab, first of all, like reaching and grabbing, the head's going this way and the pelvic's going this way, and that's not going to work very well anyways. And second of all, we'd break their spine, pulling them up this way, right? Because you're pulling them like this, and if they're facing backwards and their spine is facing forwards, right? So we start facing backwards and we have a quarter turn of our head to get through that pelvic outlet, right? And once our head is through that pelvic outlet, we have another quarter turn to get our shoulders through that pelvic outlet. So it takes two quarter turns to get us from facing backwards to facing frontward to coming out. This is mandatory midwife childbirth. And because we have this, this means that we have to have community to help us give birth. There are exceptions to every rule, absolutely. Yet we find that those exceptions are because somebody either has a very large pelvis and a very small child, or somebody who is entirely flexible and is able to do this on their own. This is not something that's very healthy. It's not something that we should be doing a whole lot of. So we have to have somebody, whether it's our husband, whether it's our friends, it doesn't matter who, somebody has to assist us in getting that baby out of our womb. So this indicates the need for community to assist us. We cannot give birth on our own. When we look at the timeline from neonate, newborn to adulthood in Homo sapiens, we have something that no other species on the planet has and no other species has ever had. We have 5 life stages from neonate to adult, and these life stages are all about brain development. You have your newborn that's learning the world around them, the sight, the smell, the taste, they're babbling, they're learning how to eat, they're learning how to raise their head, right? All of these things are things that somebody has to nurture them through. Somebody has to provide care for them, and somebody has to teach them, right? Nurture them, nurture their development, nurture their growth, right? So when we're looking at this, we see that we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Currently, our life stages span 25 years. You're 25 years when your brain fully forms and closes, basically. So we're the only species on the planet that has this long. The next closest in timeline from newborn to adult is elephants, and they're like 5 years. So we're 5 times that. And during this time, we require extensive nurturing. And because of us, and because of how much nurture our infants need, we actually need to have several people provide that nurturing. Even today, in today's society, we think that we're doing it on our own, but we're really not. Okay. And so when we look at a single parent that is doing this on their own and raising somebody from neonate to adult, they have to have a daycare center or somebody else who's babysitting their kid. Well, they go to an employment space that somebody else is providing and go shopping and getting food that somebody else is providing to get to that store. So you're not going out and hunting or gardening. All of these things still provide or still require community. You still require more than just you to raise a child. So when we're looking at 30,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, what we're looking at is having to have a community of roughly at least 30 people to be able to provide enough nurture to get one child from infant to adult, because you have to have somebody who is able to tend to the child. A squalling infant is not something you're going to take out hunting, just not. It's not really something you want to take out gathering water or gathering any of the other things that you might need to utilize to survive, because predators are going to hear that squalling infant and come, right? So you don't really want to take an infant out with you. It really kind of endangers that infant, and it really endangers you. If you do take an infant out with you, you definitely want to have several different people within your space so that so that they can help protect from anything that's happening. Maybe they're keeping eye. If you're going down to the river to gather water, maybe 2 or 3 people are keeping eye to make sure that no crocodiles or hippos are coming out of the water to get you while you're gathering that water, and maybe somebody else is carrying the baby on the back, right? If you're out gathering berries or out gathering tubers or out gathering reeds to make baskets, you need a couple of different people to ensure that no predators are getting you, to ensure defense, right? And to gather more. And because, we like to talk to each other, it makes the time go faster. When you're looking at hunting anything that is large, especially, you're going to need at least 10 members. You need at least 10 people, and the larger it gets, the more people you need. Studies have shown that it's women and men hunting. It is not men hunting, women gathering. That's not what's going on. We can actually get all of our nutrients from hunting alone, because the stomach contents provide the vegetation nutrients we need, the rudiment within the stomach. So we've shown that women and men are both hunting. And when we're looking at this, you definitely need several people to go hunting with you to make sure that you're not getting killed in the hunting, and to make sure that you're able to take down that animal and bring home food for your family. While you're doing this, you need somebody who's controlling the fire, tending the fire, making sure that the fire stays lit. Fire gives us food, which gives us brain development. It gives us tools like spears, and it also provides protection because predators won't enter a space that has fire. So when we're looking at this, we're seeing that you need somebody that's maintaining the shelter and the fire and the shelter to keep the predators at bay, to keep things going, to make sure that the fire is ready to cook when you come home with the meat, right? And then you're also going to need people who are crafting the several different types of tools that you're going to need to live between clothing and knives, spear points, things like that, basketry, dishes, just different things that we're going to need to live. You need several people crafting all of those. So when we look at all of that, you're looking at least 30 people per community to really have any rate of survivability to raise one infant from neonate to adult. Most of the time, we're seeing that through herbology, through nursing, and through just the ability that we can actually control the rate that we give children if we utilize the world around or give birth to children if we utilize the world around us. And most ancient people knew these methods of utilization to control these things. You're not looking at probably a child more than every 5 years. You want to make sure that that child is through infancy and toddlerhood before you add another infant into the brain or into the space, or you really have a lot of work on your hand that you can't really do. I don't think neurodivergence is divergent. I don't think neurotypical really exists, to be very honest, as a neurodivergent person. I believe it's kind of an imaginary status like perfect, right? Um, or normal, right? Hey, Callie. So I don't think neurotypical really exists. I think that we look at neurotypical and neurodivergent, right? And as somebody who's neurodivergent, I do know that the way that I think is different than other people, but I also know that there's a lot of people who think the way that I do. I also believe that things that provide a higher level of focus are evolutionary advantages. So I personally believe that things like autism are an evolutionary movement forward. It's moving forward in an evolutionary in it's evolving. It's a forward involvement in a timeline where we have computers that can hyper focus for us or things like that. Though autism has been around much longer than computers. Um, Things for hyper focus actually have the ability to understand more when you have that ability for that hyper focus, right? As well as, when we look at somebody who's like ADD or ADHD and their mind snaps from here to here to here, those things are creative things that are actually probably how we got all of our tools to start with, right? It's the ability to see connections that some people can't see, right? It's the ability to I don't think multitask is the right phrase, so we've been using that for a long time. But if you're like me, you'll start a conversation on Calico site in California, and you'll end up on neurodivergence, right? Your mind will connect, will connect, will connect, will connect, right? And so because of that, I think that these things are absolutely evolutionary advantages. They're movements forward in our evolutionary thought process. Uh, I personally think that for the vast majority of our timeline as sapiens and into erectus and into the other species, that what we currently consider neurodivergence has absolutely existed. And I personally believe that the vast majority of the inventions that we have, the vast majority of the new technology that we can have, comes out of neurodivergence. I think that what we consider to be neurotypical isn't actually neurotypical. It's just what somebody decided was neurotypical, and that it sometimes lacks that spark of creativity that you need to invent new things. Not that all people who are neurotypical lack creativity, yet it doesn't give that spark of this to this to this to this or the hyper focus that neurodivergence gives, right? So I think that those things absolutely are evolutionary advantages, and they go back further in time than anybody wants to think that they do. And I don't think that there is actually such of a thing as neurotypical. I think that we have to stop thinking that anything is typical, right? Like so. There's a lot of conversation about how individuality is, or individualism isn't a positive, and I agree on a lot of levels, yet I disagree on a lot of levels. A community is made up of multiple individuals who have individual thought process and individual abilities. And when I have 10 different people who have 10 different abilities, my community is stronger and better for it. So having an individual knowledge and an individual something that sings to you individually, something that you're talented at individually, these things are very positive for community benefit as a whole, right? And a community should be made up of multiple people who have individual talents, to bring those individual talents to create a community that benefits. If you have people in your community who really enjoy hunting and are really good trackers, that's a benefit to your community. But you don't want everybody in your community to only be able to hunt and track. You need a couple people to be able to cook, right? So if you have people in your community that are really good at hunting and tracking, and you have people in your community that are really good at cooking, and you have people in your community who are really good at basket weaving, and you have people in your community that are really good at tanning hides, and you have people in your community who are really good at decorating those hides and making clothing out of those hides. All of those things are individual talents and individual knowledges that are driven by the individual ness of us. We are all individuals within our space. We all think differently. We all work differently. We all live different, not live differently, but sing to different things. Like different things sing to us. And it is a convergence of all those individual things that sing to us that are dedicated towards communal growth that create a healthy and positive community. I think most of us are spicy. Well, and I think that it's the neurodivergent that takes the other one to a complex, to the Acheulean hand axe complex. It's the neurodivergent that looks at fire and goes, how can I control that? Right? How can I keep that for later? It's the neurodivergence that makes your first ovens in the Neanderthals. It's the neurodivergence that takes a leaf and folds it to make a cup. It's the neurodivergence that sees those things because it's not seeing. I think neurotypical sometimes is very much, if I am neurotypical, I see a piece of obsidian, right? Maybe I see that it's got some pretty flat planes and that's shiny. Maybe I try and see myself in it, right? Yet if I'm neurodivergent, I see more than the obsidian. I see the fault lines and the cracks within the obsidian and how to break them into something new. Neurotypical sees what's in front of it and only sees what's in front of it. Neurodivergence diverges from the typical and sees things that typical can't see, right? So I think that no, because chimpanzees can create tools, right? Corvids can create tools. So that is neurodivergence. It's seeing something and seeing what you can make out of it, figuring out how you can make something out of it, right? Instead of seeing the same old, same old. It's making up the stories in your head for how things happen. It's the 3-year-old who decided that somebody climbs a ladder every night and paints the sunset on the sky because my mama told me she wanted to paint the setting sun one day, right? It's the one that sees beyond the words, sees beyond the current, sees beyond the there, and sees into something different. That to me is really what it is. Um, and I really don't think that neurotypical really exists. I think that we have this idea of what is typical. Um, Yet even when we look at averages, even averages aren't typical. It's just average, right? So an average compiles 100 numbers and averages out what the average number is, all those numbers, you know. So because an average of 100 numbers takes that 100 numbers and adds them together and then divides them by 100, You might even have an average number that's not even a number that anybody put into the pot in the first place. So average might not even be something that a singular person has, right? And yet it's average. I think the same thing with typical. Typical is what somebody else decided is going on. And because their brain thinks that way, they think everybody else's brain thinks that way. And most of us think like that. Most of us think because my brain thinks this way, everybody's brain thinks this way, right? So they decided what typical is, right? And so I don't think it's necessarily that neurodivergence versus neurotypical exists in the way that normies want you to think it exists, if that makes sense, right? I don't think it's divergent. I think it's human. I think it's creativity. I think it's a broader understanding, right? Don't get me wrong. As somebody who is neurodivergent, I also see where it can be very difficult within this current societal structure, right? That there are problems with having what they consider neurodivergence within the current societal structure, because the current societal structure likes to monolith everything. It likes to make a difference between typical or normal and divergence or atypical, right? And so, because we live in a society that wants to monolithicize, pan everything, make everything the same, and decide that everything is supposed to be the same, it's very difficult within society today, right? And of course, any form of trauma that's induced can, take things that we consider neurodivergent to a level that is unhealthy, right? Ruminations, things like that. Yet it doesn't necessarily mean that, it's not normal, right? It's not exactly how we're supposed to be. Yeah. Standardization does nothing for any of us. Well, and the belief that you're supposed to meet somebody else's standard. As a species, we've never been monolithic. Nothing about us is monolithic. We don't like to all be the same. We like to sing to our own things, right? We've always, and that's what's always been an advantage to us. That's what's always moved us forward. It's how we got fire and tools. It's everything. It is why you have a phone, because somebody thought outside the box. When we think that everybody's supposed to exist inside a box, instead of understanding that thinking outside of the box is what creates new things, gives us new knowledges, that becomes a problem, right? As I said in YouTube, variation is an evolutionary advantage. Absolutely. I'm not sure. So what caused our brains to grow in size is the use of fire, the ability to cook our food. Cooking our food pre-digests our food for us, which gives us the ability to process a greater caloric intake from a smaller amount of food. And when that includes animal fats and fish oils, that actually goes directly to brain development. If we're looking at somebody who is in the brain development stage, from in utero all the way up into the closure of the brain, which is currently at 25. So that is what grew our brains, the size of our brains. But we now know that the size of our brains isn't actually what makes us what we consider to be the intelligent species we are. I have debate on that. And I have debate on whether we're more intelligent than other species. Yet, what is commonly considered our intelligence comes not from the size of our brains, but from the shape of our brains and from the life stages that we have. Because we have such long life stages of brain development, right? Because you have, like, I think from neonate, I think it goes from neonate to toddler. So I think it's like 2 years or 1.5 years is the first stage of brain development, right? And because that is extended for us compared to anything else. Most animals are actually fully grown and walking and gone by a year old, right? So, because we're not even able to potty ourselves or walk by a year old, our brain is exploring different functions that another animal's brain hasn't gotten the ability to explore, because of the fact that they have to learn to walk right now, and they have to learn to eat other foods right now, and they have to learn to get away from predators right now, whereas we're not, right? And so they think that it is those extended life stages and phases of brain develop that increases. They state it's the malleability of our brain, the ability for our brain to grasp new concepts, basically. And they say that it is the way that the synapses fire in our brain. And they believe that the way that the synapses fire in our brain is because of the shape of our brain. And we see this correlates with Homo naledi, who has the same brain shape as us, but has a very small brain case, and is more advanced than we are when we come onto the scene, right? Because they have cave art and burial and things like that when we're not doing any of those things, nor is any other species. And this comes from their brain shape, but not their brain size before present. Before 1950, actually, is what it is, but before present. So when we're looking at uh, our intelligence comes not from size, but from shape. And that comes from the growth patterns, how we grow, right? Um, and so uh, I think personally, because we start with the same brain shape as every other Homo species out there. Our brains are shaped like this. Only other species out there that has the current brain shape that we have is Naledi, and that's before we do. And it's still another couple 100,000 years till we have that brain shape. We start to get this brain shape that goes from this to this, forehead, neck, back of skull, that goes from this to this, after we start burying our dead and after we start doing cave art and after we start decorating our clothing. And so for me, I think that we get that brain shape and understanding when we develop the id, when we develop the sense of self, when we develop the idea that um, we start developing the idea of life after death. We start developing object permanence, and we start developing a sense of self. And I think that that's where we get the shape of our brain from and why we have the advantages that we have, right? I'm sure the brainstem does have something to do with abstract thinking. Um, though we recently realized that we have a mammalian brain, not a lizard brain, because we didn't develop from the lizards. We developed alongside the lizards, like mammals and lizards develop alongside each other. So it's not your lizard brain, it's your mammalian brain. And that is, it's exercising the brain. And so that exercising of the brain and that exercising of the idea of consciousness, right? The idea of self, I think is what leads to shape. And I think that shape leads to, or they say that shape is what leads to malleability, um, and intelligence level, right? Neanderthals had a bigger brain than we did, but they're considered to be less intelligent. And the reason is because they are considered to have their neurons don't fire as fast as ours do, is what they're stating. Something about the globular shape of our brain induces neuron firing, makes it easier. Um, yet, so Homo naledi creates hash marks. And then the earliest cave art that we have from both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens is hash marks. So, and we take tool complexes, and both Neanderthal and sapien take tool complexes from something else and make them into something new. So, do does it go? Erectus gets the ability to do food and to cook their food, and because they can cook their food, brain development gets bigger. And then when we see the hash marks from Naledi, there's a spark. Um, though we don't start doing it for another 100,000 years. But do we see them and see them long after Naledi's gone and wonder what makes them, right? Um, is that the spark? Is the spark the life stages, right? The time period of development for the brain, because the life stages, Neanderthals have 4 life stages, and early us, I think, has 4 life stages. If I recall, it gets into 5 life stages as we solidify as a species. So, yeah, like hashtags. That's our very first cave art is hashtags. So, and it's like 235 to 335,000 years old, our very first cave art, and it's hashtags. We've been using that for a long time. So does the life stages uh, equivocate that spark, right? Is that where the spark comes from? Does the spark comes because we saw a hash mark on the wall? Does the spark comes because we start in a space where there's several different species converging to create us, yet we then meet an entirely new species when we meet Neanderthal. And Neanderthal and us lived side by side for 100,000 years in the Levant area and in the Arabian Peninsula area. And during that time, we see the start of cave art, we see the start of burial, and we see the start of changes to both tool complexes. So, is it the meeting of an entirely new species that wasn't within Africa and therefore wasn't a species that we had seen before that sparks identity and therefore sparks the rest of it, right? Therefore, pushes the next of it forward. Is it meeting something new that gives us this spark of, oh, I'm me and you're you? And is it the spark of, oh, I'm me and you're you that takes us to the next level? We don't know yet what it is that sparks that. I have my personal beliefs on it. My personal beliefs are that it comes with the understanding of an id, the understanding of a conscious, of a self, the understanding of self. I'm me and you're you. Um, but that's mine. That's what I think, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that that's it. That means that's what I think, right? So I think concept of other comes in when we start to see decoration of self and burial. I think burial is really an evidence of a concept of you were alive and you're still here. I'm going to miss you. I'm going to miss the you, right? I'm going to miss who you are. Um, as opposed to you're just a member of my family and now you're gone. That is happening, they think, before that. I don't know if our first burials are actually our first concept of that. Sometimes I wonder if open air burials like we have here in Turtle Island were something that were happening. And so we were absolutely burying our dead. We were absolutely we had ceremony around our dead. We just didn't have ceremony around our dead that would make it in such a way that it would preserve it for millions of years, right? So that's another thing I think about. There's always those things I think about. What effect did psilocybin and other psychedelic plants and mushrooms have on brain development, shape, and size? There is studies that think that psilocybin has some of that has that. Most of those studies say that psilocybins come into play about 40,000 years ago. We believe that we get to the shape of our brain at 30,000 years ago. And yet, when you look at the archaeological evidence in the record, it starts like 100,000 years ago. That change of shape starts shifting at 100,000 years ago. So if the change of shape is already happening at 100,000 years ago, and then at 40,000 years ago, we start to do mushrooms and psilocybins, and roughly the same time. So between 40 and 30,000 years ago is when the shape of our brains becomes what it is currently. So it kind of, I don't know. Psilocybins could have an effect on it. Psilocybins could not have an effect on it. We see that we are doing art and identity of self and burial before we see evidence of psilocybin use. And all of those things definitely lead to the concept of id, definitely lead to the concept of self, and definitely, I believe, through these things that I've researched, lead to the start of the shape change within our brain. And so psilocybins could finalize it maybe, but they didn't initiate it to anything that I have seen. That doesn't mean that they're not important. I think psilocybins are absolutely important in brain development. I think that they're very important currently in medicine and in trying to ensure mental health. I think psilocybins are a huge helper for mental health today. So it doesn't mean that they're not important, and it doesn't mean that they don't help a lot. I'm just not sure if they're why our brain is the way it is. I think that our brain was already becoming what it is before we started inducing psilocybins within that thought process. So it might have helped it along, but it didn't do all the job. Um, all of these sites that I've got behind me are on my website currently. Underneath, I did a new tab. Well, it's not a new tab. I just rewrote the tab, and the the rewritten tab is actually rewriting the Western Hemisphere, is what it's called. So as you're looking through, you're going to find that tab, and it's going to be one of those. It's going to be one of the first tabs across the top, and it's going to be a lot of different information. Underneath that tab is a couple of different things. You're going to see that there is not only rewriting the Western Hemisphere, but you're going to see that there's a page of pre-sapien finds in the Western Hemisphere, which is what all of these are, is pre-sapien, and then sapien finds in the Western Hemisphere. And so they're different information that is actually pretty huge. And as you're looking through them, they're going to really give you more of an understanding of not only the debate and the argument and the way that the debate and the argument goes through archaeology and anthropology. It will also give you an understanding of the presence of people here prior. The presence of, again, another species that is speciated from Homo erectus that's here prior. And it's going to give you a look at Homo erectus people, or not, Homo sapiens peopling of the Western Hemisphere. So when we're looking at the Calico site in California, this is a site that Leakey worked on. If you don't know the name Leakey, Leakey is the preeminent archaeologist through the earliest part of the 1900s in Africa. Him and his wife, Mary Leakey, they discovered Lucy, and they worked in Olduvai Gorge, and they are the people who give us the largest base of our early understanding of human history. When Leakey came and worked on the Calico site, he discovered that the tools in the Calico site were very similar than the tools in Olduvai Gorge. So there has been debate as to whether or not the tools at the Calico site are actually man-made tools or they're not man-made tools. Some people want to call them lightning spalls. But when you look at the tools and you look at Leakey's notes on the tools, you can see that it is very clear evidence of human interaction with stone. You're seeing there's what we call percussion bulbs, and percussion bulbs are this kind of like a ball out that exists, or it comes into play when you're taking, so a flake or a knife or point or any of those things generally comes off of what we call a core. Okay, so you prep your core and you're going to do stuff to the outside of it to kind of sharpen the outside of it, and then you take a rock and either a rock and something else or the right kind of rock, and you hit it at the right angle and it flakes off, and the top part of it gives you a percussion bulb, which is this kind of space that kind of bulbs out at the top. And it's all from the flake, it's all from one movement, so it's not going to have retouch on it. And it is definitely, it's a definitive sign of it being purposefully flaked off of a core. There's also on the Calico site evidence of reworking flakes. And so these two things are absolute definitive human interaction with stone. So the arguments that these could be lightning spalls is really ridiculous, and is one of those things that we've talked about in here several times, where you're looking at Western science does not want to it doesn't want to allow for things that it doesn't agree with, right? It doesn't want to be told it's wrong, right? And it doesn't have, why is it not giving me the website here? Sorry, I'm trying to get to the website so I can pull up, there we go, so that I can pull up the Cactus Hill site. So when we're looking at Western science's interaction a lot of times Western science is going to deny the obvious because of the fact that it wants to ensure that what it's been saying this whole time is the truth. It doesn't like a lot of times, it's that justification for atrocity that we've talked about. A lot of times it's that fear, right? And a lot of times it's that refusal to understand that, like, well, if I'm not the best, then it didn't happen. Like, if it's not me, then it didn't happen, right? Um, and so you see that there's a lot of that within archaeology and anthropology. And so, because you see that there's a lot of that within archaeology and anthropology, you're going to see that there's going to be an argument on each and every one of these things that um, changes the way that archaeology and anthropology and Western thought view the world. When it decentralizes it from Western thought, right? When it says, well, maybe something else is older, maybe something else is different, maybe something else did this, it's a threat. And so it's going to argue it. And so we do find that there's a lot of argument about the Calico site. The argument with the Calico site uh, ranges from whether or not the tools are actually tools to the dating. But even in the dating, the youngest dating, as in the dating closest to today's time, is 70,000 years old. So this would absolutely be, if it's 70,000 years old, would be Homo sapien instead of pre-Homo sapien. The other dating on the site, though, is 200,000 years old. The 200,000-year-old dating will absolutely be a descendant species of Homo erectus instead of Homo sapien, because Homo sapien isn't even converged as a species at 200,000 years ago. It is Homo erectus who has created their own species, speciated here within the Western Hemisphere at that point of time, with everything that we're finding prior to 100,000 years ago within the Western Hemisphere. So when we're looking at the artifacts within this, Leakey sees over 600 definitively man-made artifacts within these pits. And he sees that the artifact making starts at 50,000 years ago. So the top layer of the artifact making, as you're digging down in the strata, is 50,000 years old. Now, this is definitely going to this is most likely at this point of time, a combination of the species that have made the older layers and Homo sapien, who is coming in at this time. Current evidence really shows that Homo sapien is making it to Turtle Island and Abiyala at 50,000 years ago, between DNA evidence and between current sites of Homo sapien finds. And so with this, what we're seeing is that top layer at 50,000 years ago, or the top of the site at 50,000 years ago, is most likely going to be a convergence of species, right? It's either going to be the species itself, or it's going to be a convergence of the two species. So of the 600 significant specimens, Leakey is seeing workshop materials, including flakes, rejects, and markedly modified amorphous objects, lithic tools, both fragmentary and complete. Technically significant workshop material includes flakes with bulb scars, concaval complex flakes, soft hammer flakes, flakes with partial or totally obliterated bulbs, flakes and cores with prepared platforms. So anything that is prepared is absolutely flying arrow. You got names? The oldest one that I can find so far is Heotaloka, which is 250,000 years ago, or 800,000 years ago. But if you have names on sites that are older than this, I would love the site name, or an age in the archaeologist, or anything that you have on it, so I can go and do some search and some research on it. I'm compiling these things, or these different sites, so that people have access to the knowledge on these different sites. And I'm also trying to ensure that all of this information gets out there. So if you have sites that are older than these sites, any information that you have, so I can go and do some research, would be very helpful to me. And there's features such as apparently artificial arrangement of the rocks at the Calico site. There's a hand axe at the Calico site. There is, and I'm going to show you guys this one. there is the bulb thing that we're talking about. YouTube, I'm going to turn you around for a second. It's going to look weird for a second, I know. And then let's do this so that you guys can see. And we're going to flip my camera. Maybe, if I can remember how to do it. There we go. So this here is that bulb that we're talking about. You can see where it kind of comes out, right? This is a bulb. So as you're flaking it off, this is a multiple scraper, right? On a flake with a prepared platform. So this is a part of the prepared platform here. And down here is a part of the prepared platform. And remember when I was saying with cores, let me make sure that YouTube is seeing this right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You're going to go back and forth and back and forth. As you're making the core on the outside, you're going to flake off the core on the outside, and then you're going to hit here, and it's going to pull off that entire flake so that you can get the tool from it. So it's the outside that you're going to see the prepare on, right? And so it's preparing the platform so that when you're utilizing it, you can get a good cut on it, basically, or a good blade. Blade is the word I'm looking for. A good blade on it, right? And so when we're looking at these tools at the calico site, I didn't want to do that. When we're looking at the tools on the calico site, we are absolutely seeing these are evidence of human interaction. So there are people who are debating it, and they're saying that they're called lightning spalls or natural artifacts, basically. That's incorrect. If you're looking at the actual tools, you can see that that's not what it is. There we go. Okay, come on. Why are we having problems? We're having problems. Oh, it's just not going to do it. Okay. Sorry. The YouTube is inwitaord.com. So when we're looking at the calico site, we are absolutely looking at tool usage that is absolute definitive tool usage. When we're looking at that site and we're looking at the dating again, the top layer is dated at 50,000 years old. The other thing with the calico site, thank you for stating what you just stated because it actually reminded me. The other thing with the calico site is that there are stones there that are not from that area. So a lot of times when we're looking at, let me find, it states, okay, here it is, I think. No, that's not it. It states what the stones are, but there are stones there that are from different areas. So from outside of the mountains. This is in a mountain range. And there's chert there, I think is what, oh, here it is. Nope, that's not it. It's in here. It's in here. I know it is. Because I was reading it earlier. Here it is. Okay, so there's moss agate and chalcedony that are not from those mountain ranges. There's 5 quartz crystals, which are not of local origin. Of the 5 crystals, 1 is smoky and 3 are chipped. The nearest probable origin is a large pegamite dike 3 miles north of the fan and at a lower elevation, so it's not washing into this, right? Um, and The Chalcondani outcrops in the Mule Canyon, where this site is located at within Calico Mountain Range, are usually rather brittle, and so they're not something that's useful for tool making. So the Chalcondani being from outside this space is pretty obvious. So anything that is looks like it's been made into a tool, or any stone that's from another space entirely, is going to be one of those things that is not, that is obviously transported, right? It's obviously brought into the space, and it's something that's obviously brought into the space. It is not something that is naturally there, naturally occurring in that space, which is human occupation. And it's considered human occupation pretty much anywhere else, so it's considered human occupation there, right? Um, the area of the controversy of age of the site, there's two schools of thought. There's one that thinks that the building of the fan occurred about 70,000 years ago near the beginning of the Wisconsin glacial period. And there's a fan, those who believe that the fan is much older. The fan is, the site itself is kind of like in this, there's a fan of the layout of the site, basically. Um, and they think that it's 250,000 to 500,000 years ago. And that is the group that Leakey belongs to. And this is about the geological age. Uh, it's called an alluvial fan, is what it is found within. And there's also a designated hearth or fire circle of semicircular rocks, or like in a semicircle of rocks, 9 large and 8 small rocks tilts slightly into a circle and are arranged in groups of 3 large, 2 small, 3 large. So this is again uh, evidence of human occupation at even at the most earliest dating of it, prior to 70,000 years ago, right? And so with this, we are absolutely looking at another species of human that's here. This again gives support to the multi-regional thought process and gives support to Turtle Island Indigenous nations who talk about having been created here. Because these are groups of people who were enveloped in into the sapiens, when the sapien groups come to Turtle Island and Abiyala, they envelop these groups within them. Arrow, do you have names on any of the other sites? I mean, I'm honest in that. Like, that's why it says, do you know of others? I'm really honest. I'm trying to find as much information as I can in as much other sites. So if you do know of sites that are older than this, I would love information on them. When we're looking at the Hyotloka site. Now, the not the Sruti Macedon site, the Calico site is starting in the 1930s, right? So their first excavations are extremely old on the Calico site. When we're looking at Leakey visits in 63, when we're looking at the Heotloka site, we're looking at a site that was found first in the 1960s. So we're looking at sites that have been known for a long time. There is a lot of debate over whether or not so there's debate over whether or not the timeline is correct. And there's debate over whether or not sometimes whether or not the tools are correct. So when we look at the Calico site, if there's like a semicircular stone pit with fire inside of it, and we're looking at things that have bulbs on them, and we're looking at things that have been transported from somewhere else, this is to anybody else within the art, if it's seen anywhere else, it is absolutely going to be called presence of human occupation. Um, when it is being claimed as not being actual tools, what we're looking at is people who are debating whether or not humans stand upright, right? Like debating against the obvious because they're afraid of what the obvious means, right? So when we're looking at that, that is absolutely that doubling down of the racism within anthropology and archaeology, and doubling down of the fear that we see with a lot of people, right? Um, when we're looking at the Heotloka site, what we're looking at is a site that's earliest dating is 40,000, or like closest to us, is 40,000 years ago. Further back, it goes to 800,000 years ago. So the dating with that, some of the dating technique, not techniques, some of the people who have dated it have called it 40,000 years ago. Some of the people who have dated it have called it 250,000 years ago. And some of the people who have dated it have called it 800,000 years ago. So when we're looking at this site, and the way that the debate is going with the timeline, you're going to see sometimes it's different dating techniques. Sometimes it's the same dating technique and they're just coming up with different dates. You got to wonder what they're running and how they're getting those different dates. Um, Sometimes a lot of what we're looking at with the Heotloka site is dating based on the timeline of the stratification of the layers, right? Hey, so if so in this case specifically, there's a layer of ash, and so there are people that state that the layer of ash comes around at 40,000 years ago, that there's an eruption at 40,000 years ago that causes this layer of ash. And there are people that state that that eruption is 250,000 years ago, and that's why that layer of ash is there. So you're looking at geologists dating the eruptions basically differently, or the timeline of those eruptions differently. When they're looking at the Heotloka site, again, it starts in the 1960s, and there's a lot of back and forth debate over it between pretty much two people for quite some time. Irwin Williams decides that she thinks that it's much younger, and McIntyre decides that she thinks it's much older. And these are two of the original archaeologists. And this goes back and forth for a long time. The bones are all pre-mineralized, and there's no carbon 14 dating possible. So they have to date the stratified layers instead. There isn't debate on whether or not the tools and the bones are actually tools and bones. So it's not actually human bones, it is animal bones. Um, and it is uh, tools among the animal bones. So there's bifurcated flakes, which means that these are stone tools where both sides of the tool has been reworked to make it sharp. So this is absolute evidence of human working of tools. And there's also hammerstones and cobblestones, which we also see at the Cerruti Mastodon site, and we also see at the Calico site. Hammerstones and cobblestones are used to break up bone. Cobblestone is going to be a kind of flat stone that you place on the ground, and you're going to place something on top of it, and you're going to take the hammerstone and you're going to break it apart with that hammerstone. And so we see that this is considered part of the Oldowan tool complex. So prior to Homo erectus, we now know that's Paranthropus boisei who creates it, but was carried on within Homo erectus for quite some time. And so is seen in, and it really hammerstones and cobblestones are used forever. And so we do see that those kind of carry down as well. We see that the flora and fauna, or not flora, the fauna that is seen within the Heotloka site is old. So it predates, absolutely, hey Aria, it predates all the other or sorry, it predates the timeline of when that type of animal was not extinct predates 70,000 years ago in many cases. And so, unless we're looking at like I picked up bones and reworked them, right? This is definitely something prior to 70,000 years ago. Um, there's a butchered mastodon at this site. Um, they used open system thorium to age it to 245,000 years ago. Um, a bone from a camel pelvis among a layer with bifacial tools gives a age greater than 180,000 years ago. So what they're looking at is not only the animals killed with the tools right there in the kill site or the butcher site, right, which we call in situ. Um, but they're also looking at not but and they're also looking at the timeline of the layer. So if the timeline of the layer states that it's 200,000 years ago, and the animal that's in that site is dated to that time period, like we know that they were alive during that time period, this really doubles down that that's 200,000 years ago. We know that it's below this volcanic ash, and we say that the volcanic ash is 200,000 years ago, and we know the camels at this stage of their evolution is 200,000 years ago, and so this really doubles down on it. The bifacial tools among the camel pelvis is a very definitive thing. It's one of the bifacial tools are absolutely something that humans create. You don't get bifacial tools just from rocks falling against each other because again, a bifacial tool is something that has two sides to it and they're kind of worked after their flake, right? And so with this, we're definitely seeing um, that there is a lot of evidence for the prior to 200,000-year-old uh, occupation of this site. Not prehumans, they're still going to be humans because we are looking at another descendant species of Homo erectus like we are. So it's like Neanderthals and Denisovans are human. This descendant species of Homo erectus that we would see here in Abayala and Turtle Island is absolutely human. It's absolutely going to fall under the genus Homo. It's not Homo sapien. It is still human. And it is the species that gets enveloped into Homo sapien when Homo sapien arrives. So its DNA is still present on the planet and it is a human species. The person that is debating the timeline, um, when the dating is coming through from other people, their response is that they were considered by that person to be wildly too old, so therefore impossible. And when we're looking at that, we need to understand that things like that, it's impossible. I think it's too old based on somebody's perception and refusal, entrenchment. Entrenchment is the best word for that one. Based on somebody's entrenchment into the old thought process, right? Kind of negates whether or not their impression is valid, right? If you are acting off of being entrenched in an ancient thought process and refusing to actually contemplate that there might be something new, then that tells me that your bias is impeding your ability to understand and learn new knowledge. So I would state for me, with all of the different dating techniques that we see on this site, all the different dates that we see on this site, and the different tools and the different animals that we see on this site, we are absolutely looking at something that is at least 200,000 years old, right? So this will give us our second site in North America that is over 200,000 years old at this point. And again, anything that is called underneath the genus Homo is human. So these are absolutely human. They're not Homo sapien. They're absolutely human, right? And that is also important that we acknowledge that these are absolutely human. They are enveloped into the Homo sapien population when the Homo sapien arrives, and they are still with us today because they are seen in indigenous Turtle Islanders and in indigenous Abayalians. And because they are seen in indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere today, they are still around and they are human, right? And so this is absolutely evidence of speciating here, evidence of becoming human here, right? And evidence of that admixture as we're moving across and we're migrating across the planet as Homo sapiens ourselves. Again, we are currently all Homo sapien, and every single Homo sapien on this planet has admixture from at least one other species. Those who only have admixture from one other species are those who only have admixture with Neanderthal. And that includes the majority of Africa and Western Eurasia and a good part of actually Asia as well. So, of Eastern Eurasia. So, the vast majority of the Eurasian continent and the vast majority of Africa are Homo sapien and Neanderthal. Everywhere else has other species that kind of come into it. Pretty much everybody on the planet has Homo sapien and Neanderthal, or we're all Homo sapien, but pretty much everyone on the planet has Neanderthal except for two communities within Africa. The Yoruba community and the Kwe community do not have Neanderthal DNA. They do have what we call ghost species DNA. They have three of those. So every species or every human on this planet has admixture from other species. The vast majority of us have admixture from Neanderthal. And then a good portion of us have admixture from other species. Like we see that Southeast Eurasia, the islands of the South Pacific, Australia, Turtle Island, and Abiyala all have admixture from Denisovan. And we see that Indigenous Australians have admixture from a ghost species, and Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Indigenous Abayalians have admixture from ghost species. So that would be sites that are related to that ghost species. And again, if you're just coming in with ghost species are species that we see a couple of genetics in our DNA or a couple of fingerprints, touches of them in our DNA, yet we haven't found the full genome of the species because we haven't found them in the fossil record. There are roughly 5 ghost species that we see within modern Homo sapien DNA, 1 ghost species that we see within Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, and then there's a 7th ghost species that's recently been written about, and I'm not exactly sure where they're seeing that DNA yet because I haven't. It was written about in the writing on the new species that was found last month, HLD6. So when we're looking at these, what we're looking at is archaeological evidence of us being here way, way earlier than most thought processes give us the timeline here, right? This, again, really correlates with many indigenous Turtle Island and Abiyalian tradition that that we speciated here. Not all of us have tradition that we speciated here. There are many that do have tradition of speciating here, though. And those who have the tradition of speciating here, this gives weight to that. The other site that we have on the background here is the Cerruti Mastodon site. This one was pretty recent in the news. And the Cerruti Mastodon site is about 130,000 years old. There is juvenile mastodon bones that are broken when fresh among hammerstones and cobblestones. We call the among in situ. So where you see the juvenile mastodon bones, and then there's a couple of stones in here. So hammerstones and cobblestones that actually have residue on them of breaking those bones apart. So residue of blood and things like that, bone residue on the hammerstones and cobblestones. The method or the break pattern on the bones shows that these bones were broken when wet, and the dating on this is 130,000 years old. There isn't a lot of debate on this site. This is a site that initially had some debate because it was 130,000 years old, and the other ones aren't, they're still debating the other ones. And so there's always going to be people entrenched. Even those who debate the Cerruti Mastodon site state that it looks exactly like what the principal archaeologist of San Diego's Natural History Museum, who is the lead archaeologist for this Rudy Mastodon site, states they are: the butchering of a mammoth at about 130,000 years ago. So, when you're butchering a large animal in a space that you have a lot of predators in, especially a lot of large predators, you're going to get as much of that animal as you possibly can, and you're going to run away as quick as you possibly can because you don't want to be bait. You don't want to sit among the bait and let the saber tooths come in, correct? So, to do this, you're going to break open the bones. Bone marrow is an important dietary thing for all humans, right? Bone marrow actually has so much protein within it. There's a lot of fat within it. All of these things are great for brain development. All of these things help keep us alive. And bone itself is something that we utilize for tools. And we've been utilizing bone for tools for hundreds of thousands of years. Um, and we see bone tools that are thousands, hundreds of thousands of years old. And the bone tools that we see, you're going to be utilizing bone tools for awls. You're going to utilize them for needles. You're going to use bone to create stone tools. To do the fine edge flake, you want antler or bone. To get those tiny little flakes along the edge of a stone tool, you want antler or bone. You don't want another stone because you'll crack it, especially with obsidian. So you're going to see that bone tools are going to be in use in pretty much all areas of creating other tools, creating other needs. So when we're breaking apart the juvenile mastodon bones at the kill site, we're breaking it apart to get as much of the marrow and the tools that we can, because it's in the long bones, the tools and the marrow that you can, and get out of there as quick as you can so that you don't get attacked by the other predators coming along to devour this kill. So this site is not a site that's really being debated anymore. It is a site that was initially debated, but at this point of time, the Rudy Mastodon site is not being debated. It is a pretty definitive site of evidence of humans being here 130,000 years ago. The other two sites are still debated. The debates on the other sites are about timelines for the most part. Sometimes they're about tool usage, but as we've discussed, the tools are pretty definitive human tools. If it's a stone that is not found in that area, somebody had to transport it to that area. And there are certain things like retouching of flakes, having the percussion ball, things like this are indicative. We look at those things and we always say that's human. Whenever we find those things, we go, oh, that's human. That's human making. So when you have people who are really entrenched in their racism, and people who are really entrenched in their thought that, Europeans are somehow the greatest, you end up with people who are denying very obvious evidence, right? And when you're looking at the dating on these things, even the dating that debates the oldest dating states that it's way older than most people would accept. So even if we go by the most young of the dates, these sites are at least 40 to 70,000 years old. So, and that's if we go by the debaters, if we go by the naysayers' thought processes. And most of the time with the naysayers' thought processes, we're not looking at dating that is using several different effective tools. The datings that give us the dates of 200,000 and 250,000 years old in these sites are dates that are being used by several different dating methods. So if you have two or three different dating methods saying 200,000 years ago and one dating method saying 40,000 years ago, I'm going with the three that are saying 200,000 years ago, not the one that is saying 40,000 years ago, because there's a preponderance of evidence to the contrary. So when we're looking at these sites being 200,000 years or more ago, this is pretty significant, solid evidence of it. Again, you are always in science going to have people who are debating. We still have debate over the theory of gravity. The law of gravity is not up for debate. The theory of gravity is up for debate. We still have debate over the theory of evolution. We still have debate over the theory of the peopling of Eurasia. We still have debate and recent changing to the timeline of our evolution, right? And the recent changing to the timeline of our evolution proved a theoretical method of evolution correct that we did not believe could actually work. It was just a theory before then, right? It hadn't been tested out because it was some theories. So theory is usually something that's been tested, like scientific theory has been tested. Yet there are things that are theories that are like they've tested it out in a hypothetical model, but they haven't had the actual proof, right? Um, so hypothesis and theory are two different things. Hypothesis is I think something. A theory is something that has so you observe, you hypothesize or think, you predict, you test, and if the test proves true, then it becomes a theory. So the theoretical, when something is theoretical, it isn't quite a theory yet, right? Does that make sense? Like if I have a theoretical method of evolution, I haven't had proof that that's the way that it happens yet. But a theory itself is something that has been tested out, and therefore it is not a hypothesis. Um, when we're looking at the theoretical method of evolution through convergence, and this just gets proved this last year, we're definitely seeing that as we are understanding and moving our thought processes forward, we're getting these new understandings. And as these new understandings are coming about, things like the Calico site and the Heotloka site are really starting to prove to be real, right? Really starting to prove those older dates are true, and really starting to prove that that entrenchment that is debating it is incorrect. So again, you see within any field of science that there are debates at both sides. The theory of gravity, there's like 6 theories of gravity out there. So you have people that are like, well, this is how I think gravity works. And you have people that are like, well, this is how I think gravity works. And both of those things have been tested and proven to work within those ways. It doesn't mean that, one counteracts the other all the time. And so you're going to have several different people having several different ideas. Again, as we were talking about earlier, the idea of neurotypical is ridiculous. Nothing's typical. Typical is ridiculous. And we're not monolithic. Nothing about us is monolithic, right? So when we have people who are really entrenched in this old method of thought instead of willing to accept and understand new thought processes, that is that kind of like, I want the typical because I don't want truth. I don't want anything that challenges my view of perception of reality, right? Um, I'm going to go ahead and go. I don't want to stay on too long. I do have other things that I need to do today. Um, thank you, everybody, for coming in. I have things that I like to say at the end, so we're going to say those now. We talked earlier about how biologically we are nurturing and communal, and we can prove that through biology. Because we are nurturing and communal as a species, the society that we live in today, yeah. The society that we live in today is kind of sick. The society that we live in today is kind of ill. And a healthy response to a society that is ill is depression and anxiety. So, when you're feeling this depression and anxiety that the vast majority of us feel in a society that is not supportive of nurture and not supportive community, and therefore is a very ill society, that depression and that anxiety is a healthy response to a sick society, to a sick space. And many of us believe that we're the problem. Many of us believe that, maybe if I could just be easier with it, or, well, it's not society that's the problem, it's me that's the problem. So I want to remind you that your feelings of depression and anxiety are a healthy response to a failing society, because your feelings are a healthy response to a failing society. This makes you necessary. This makes you not the problem. This makes you the solution. Because those of us who have the ability to perceive it, the ability to understand it, are those of us who can change it. You can't change something if you don't see a need to change it, right? You have to see that the need is there. You have to see what is wrong, and you have to see a way forward. So you are absolutely necessary. You are not the problem. You are the solution, right? And Ella, you were totally right, right? 20 years ago, they also thought Neanderthals couldn't talk, right? So when we are looking at that, I want you to remember that you are the solution, not the problem. You are necessary. You are valued just for being alive. And we are all valuable just for being alive. Our value is not on what somebody can exploit out of us. And society currently teaches you that your only value is in what you can be exploited for. That is not value. Your value is in living and breathing and contributing your thoughts, yourself, to being in this space. And that in and of itself is valuable. And those of us who see the illness and are feeling the natural, healthy response to that illness are doubly valuable because we are what is needed to see a pathway through. Now, I personally believe and will always support and will always double down on this that the pathway through is land back globally to Indigenous communities across the globe ensures a return to a honorable harvest, harmonious method of interacting with the planet and with the biome. And that harmonious method of interacting with the biome that we will get with land back and returning the tending of the biome to Indigenous communities will stop the extinction of our species, right? So, land back on a global scale is a beautiful way past where we're at to return to where we were prior to violence, prior to stratified societies, prior to narcissistic God kings maintaining control of you by teaching you that nurture and community are wrong and to other everybody around you so that they can maintain that control of you so they can exploit you for all your worth. You are worthy. You are valuable. You are necessary and you are needed. You are worthy. You are valuable. You are necessary and you are needed. So today, give yourself grace. Remember that this is because you're having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. And when you are sitting with yourself, remember your value is not in what you can be exploited for. Your value is in your existence. I love you all very much. And we have a pathway through. We'll get there. Give yourself grace, give yourself love. And I'll be back. I'll be back. Probably not till Monday, but I'll be back. So take care, everybody. Much love to everybody. And give yourself grace this year. All right. It's day, right? Breathe it in a little bit. Maybe go out and touch grass because touching grass always helps, right? And take care of yourself and those around you. Much love, everybody. Bye, YouTube. Much love to you as well. Take care.